So, hi, everybody. I think we're going to come back and start off with our second panel of the day. But before we do, a couple reminders again. There's CLE and HR credit. There's a new sheet for you to sign up on. And then somebody lost their parking ticket and validation. If that happens to be you, it's over there at the registration desk. So don't leave without making sure you have your parking materials. So this presentation, I think, is going to be really interesting. I have actually just now started to see a lot of people thinking about cybersecurity in terms of employee benefit plans. I mean, we've had HIPAA and those kinds of regulations for a long time, but this is a little bit different, looking at it in terms of security for lots of different types of things. I mean, I think this might be kind of a scary presentation, but I hope that you learn a lot. I'm going to let Bob and Holly introduce themselves, but they're going to be talking about cybersecurity and employee benefit plans.
Good morning. My name is Bob Cattanach. I am a partner here at Dorsey, and I spend a lot of my time in cybersecurity and privacy. And by way of overview, this morning's session, we have a lot of material and not a lot of time. So in the beginning, we're going to maybe chop it a little bit. And then when we get sort of the middle, the Holly's part, we'll maybe spend a little bit more time. And if you have questions, we will do our best to try to address them as we go along. We will be moving briskly. Holly, you want to tell us about yourself?
And I'm Holly Fistler. I'm a senior attorney in the Benefits and Compensation Group, working in both qualified plans and health and welfare benefits.
So the first maybe handful of slides, probably things you already know. But sometimes it's good just to see them on a piece of paper or on the screen. I think by way of overview, the one thing, and I've been doing this for a few years now, that is so interesting is when you look at the threats that are out there, and employees are still some of the most challenging ones, and then the various vulnerabilities, and then the risks they can create. It's pretty daunting. And the one thing I've seen over the evolution of this area is the sophistication of the bad guys is increasing enormously. So as people up their game, and I think generally speaking, people are sensitive to cybersecurity, the bad guys are also upping their game. It's kind of like an arms race. This is a slide that, again, pretty self-evident. We'll leave it in there for you just to take a look at. In terms of employee benefit plans, I think if you look at the left side of this, hacktivism, crime, and insiders, that's your biggest threats. It's not the sort of thing typically, frankly, that nation states are all that keen to do. But there's plenty of risk out there, both by way of financial as well as reputational. And then and we'll talk about this in a minute, the burdens that will be created if you have an incident are very significant, regardless of the source. I think probably all of you are aware of, but I just have it up here real quickly. The most recent one was WannaCry, where they encrypt the files. I know there was a lot of health organizations in the UK that were affected, not a lot in the US. I think our systems were a little bit more up to date and patches. But what I would share with you is that I think benefit plans are going to be more and more in the crosshairs of the outside intruder, because there's such a wealth of information in your plans. And at the end of the day, what they're going to do is look at the low-hanging fruit. And if they can find some place that has a lot of information and it's not too tough to get into, that's where they're going to gravitate. What's interesting, very briefly, I think, and the WannaCry ransomware was interesting because right now that little cottage industry of ransomware, they are very sophisticated. They have help desks to help you get your systems unencrypted when you pay your Bitcoin ransom. So these are cabals of criminals in loosely organized or sometimes not so loosely organized locations. Here again, what's at risk, you all already know this, but for benefit plans, probably credit card's not a big deal, but you start looking at business downtime, reputation, and then the loss of confidence when something happens. It's a terrible feeling. So here's one of the slides that I did want to have you pay just a minute's worth of attention. This is, sort of basic data, the average cost of a breach and how it's going up. But look at that last number, U.S. average cost for each exposed record, $221. Now, $221 doesn't seem like a fortune, right? I'll ask you to do your math. How many records are you involved with? And multiply that times 221 and consider your exposure. We're going to talk about vendors in a little bit, but I hope I will remember to come back and use this figure when you're trying to discuss with vendors, or if you're a vendor, discuss with your customer the acceptance or transfer of risk. Again, these are things that you know about, but what I think is important on this slide is the indirect costs, and this is the Ponemon Institute's very well regarded. These are real numbers. These are hard numbers. The indirect costs are significantly 2 to 1 virtually greater than the direct costs. And when we come back in a little bit to talk about cyber insurance, remember this slide, because virtually none of the indirect costs are insurable. So this is a slide I've used for quite some time now, and the reason I have it here for you is because I want you to imagine that something has happened in one of your benefit plans where there's been an intrusion. And everyone, attention will be focused on that. And they're going to want to know what happened and what can we say? What can we say to the people whose information may have been affected? And the reason this slide is important is that it takes, and I've lived this 100 times, from the moment you discover that there's been an incident until you really know what happened is the better part of 2 months on a good day. And you're going to have the CEO and the board wanting to know in 2 hours, what did they get? How much are we at risk? What can we, I want to be able to say something to the people whose information was affected. And the sad truth is until you get, frankly, an outside forensic investigator in there to image the servers that were compromised, understand, look at the logs, it's weeks before you really know. Now, you might have, within 48 hours, 72 hours, you might have some general ideas. You'll know if you have a huge problem or maybe only a big problem. But the purpose of this slide is if you have the unfortunate experience to have an intrusion, there are no easy answers, there's no good answers, there's no quick answers, and there's an enormous amount of tension to get the word out. So you're going to have this wanting to get out ahead of it, but wanting to get it right, and those two are going to be in conflict. So what do you do? Huh? This is a 5 proactive steps you can take to get ready for the day when, not if, someone gets into your system. And the reason I've put them here is it's so hard. Sort of basic information governance. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But where do you start? Huh? How do you make sure you really know you have an idea of what the threats are and how you are prepared or not prepared to deal with those threats? If you start with the end in mind and say, okay, how do we make sure we're ready for an incident if one occurs? The number one thing is know where your data is and know where it resides, and that's a tall order. No question about that. And if we have some time, we can talk about some practical ways that you might start that process. But for this group in particular, and I've learned a lot getting ready for this, it's the enormous reliance on vendors and the interchange with vendors, and that vendor relationship is acutely important in the benefit plan area. We're going to talk a little bit about an incident response plan, not because you're going to be incident response plan experts when you leave here today, but just so you have an idea of what it might look like, and the value of identifying the people that are going to be part of that incident response. And once you get those people identified, then they will be with the champions of good information governance, because they have ownership, they get what's at stake. So if you can start with, okay, if we have an incident, who's going to step up? Who's going to be in the room? And you get those, and that's a C-suite typically, group of people. In fact, I think they're right here. Oops, 1 second here. Yeah. So this might be, and this is ahead a little bit, but I think it's worth just focusing on for a second. To get ready for this, you're going to have to be these kind of people. It's different for different companies, but these are the kind of people that need to be in that room, looking each other in the eye and say, okay, if we have a problem, what are we going to do? We'll talk a little bit, if we have time, about not just having a plan, but practicing it, and then we're going to talk a fair amount about the concept of cyber insurance, not specifics. So this is, I think, my last slide here, and then Holly's going to give you the benefit plan specific. But, you know, information governance sounds pretty dry, doesn't it? Like, geez. But it's so critical that until you understand what data is being collected, who has access to it, how long are you retaining it, and why. And there's a lot of discussion these days about destruction. What really is destruction? How do you know? But anyway, if you get your arms around the data and map the flows, and then you can start categorizing that data, what's important, what can we, maybe recognize. You can't protect everything. And there's some data that's basically in the public domain, so why bother to try to protect it? But then if you can focus on the data that is important, that does need protection, and assume, really important, that people will get into your systems. It's going to happen. The key now is monitoring those systems to look for unusual activity so that you can then respond. And then we've talked about the process being developed and then having it documented. So, Holly, why don't you take us through some of the uniqueness of the benefit plan world?
Well, as you all know, and as Bob already introduced, one of the key aspects of employee benefit plan data management is that plan sponsor vendor relationship. So this slide gives you an example of many different types of vendors who are going to be hosting benefit plan data. This is by no means an exhaustive list. In addition to your insurers, your claims administrators, your TPAs, don't forget as well payroll vendors, leave management administrators, and disability management administrators. The idea is being able to know who you're working with and where that data is going to, and who with your vendors you are able to call when questions come up or issues arise. Now, as you know, selecting these vendors is an iterative process. It is something that takes time. There are discussions that go back and forth. And in order to have that security practices discussion, one of the best times to do it is either before retention or when those agreements come up for renewal and you're taking a look at the agreements again. It's always a great time to be able to ask those questions. Being able to ask, okay, so with your staff, how are they trained? How are you knowing that they are trustworthy enough to be handling our plan data? Is it going to be located on site, or are you going to have most of our data outsourced to cloud storage in the United States, even abroad? It's important to know where that data is going to reside. Questions about encryption of data, although it seems like a very simple question to ask, more and more encryption questions are less easy to answer. because there isn't just one way of encrypting data. Sometimes it's the data that's in transit, or that resides on an online portal that you're able to access, or it could be the entire system. So having a grasp on whether or not they encrypt it and how is always a good thing to know. Intrusion testing. That's practicing your plan at the vendor level to make sure that if there is the type of intrusion, you know exactly what that vendor is going to be doing to detect and address any kind of attempted breach. Security certifications, these are fabulous tools that help benefit plan sponsors and even vendors take some of the guesswork out of the discussions that are going back and forth. So what do we mean by these? Well, first of all, there's SOC2 certifications, which stands for Service Organization Control Certifications. This is an independent third-party assessment, which basically says that the tools in place and the practices in place are more than sufficient to take care of the security of the data that's retained. An additional and also very high-quality certification is an ISO certification, which stands for International Standard for Information Security.
Yeah, and we after talking with our clients, bit the bullet and got ISO certified. It is a very rigorous process. It takes time and resources, but the number one, we're a better place for it. Actually, yesterday and today are the second anniversary audits for us, so our fingers are crossed. But for clients to be able to know that we've not just talked the talk, we've walked the walk, we've gotten ISO 27,000 certified, then that's one thing they can check off their list that, well, we have to worry a little less about that at least. And one of the challenges, of course, is that you can't be cybersecurity experts. So if a vendor says X, Y, or Z, how do you know, right? You could do a site visit and audit, but then that sort of puts you in the position of assessing, and if you miss something, then where are you? Because you went out and looked. So I think there's a lot of, in the commercial space, a lot of discussion happening right now as between vendors and their customers about who is going to, number one, accept the risk, and two, how is one to determine whether the person accepting that risk really is up to the task.
And finally, where do all of these discussions reside? Where do they end up? They're going to end up in the contractual requirements in your administrative services agreements, or if you are entering into agreement for your group health plan, into a business associate agreement. The idea is that once you've had these discussions, you're able to put these provisions into the agreements. Now, as we all know, what ends up in those agreements will depend on the parties' negotiations, whether or not different provisions can be added or declined. The vendor's framework, exactly what are they capable of doing? It's not worth very much for the vendor to promise the moon if it's a very basic protection that they're able to implement in their information systems. And finally, as Bob had mentioned, the party's willingness to accept risk transfer. Who is going to take responsibility for certain portions of any kind of data breach? Who is going to take responsibility for accepting liability that might not be covered by the other party?
And one of the things that we see a lot is when you have a vendor that's compromised, often it's a payment processing or a payroll vendor, who is going to take responsibility for the breach notification requirements that flow from that compromise? Now, some vendors will offer to do it because they'd like to control the cost, and the challenge there is how it's your relationship probably with the people whose information has been compromised, and do you want to just hand that over to someone else to manage after there's been an incident? So I think more and more you're going to see express contractual provisions about, for example, who, if there is an incident, if there's a breach, if there's a compromise, who's going to take responsibility for, number one, assessing it, number two, notifying the people, the customers that have to be notified, and then more and more attorneys general under state breach notification laws are demanding to be put in the loop. And those are increasingly challenging discussions to have as states' attorneys general get more active in the space.
We're going to go over these pages extraordinarily lightning quick, but this is a wonderful takeaway to look at later on. It's just a general checklist of those different questions that you can ask to spark that discussion, to get that relationship going. So when you're talking with your vendors, and as vendors, when you're discussing agreements with employee benefit plans, be ready for some of these questions. You know, have there been breaches in the past? What's been done? What are the systems for dealing with threats, and are they updated regularly? As far as what goes on internally with vendor procedures, is there a security policy and privacy policy? Is it updated regularly? Where is information stored? Is it on portable media devices such as laptops or flash drives? And is there a chief information security officer that is in charge of managing all of this? And most importantly, if they have all of these internal controls, does it also extend to customers' data, to benefit plans' data? And finally, as far as external support, does the vendor carry cyber insurance, and are they having an annual independent assessment to, you know, kick the tires, make sure that their security systems are up to date?
Maybe to pause here for a moment about what's perhaps very special about your space as benefit plans. There is potential, at least, and I sense the actual disparate negotiating positions depending on whether you're the customer or the vendor. If for example, if you use Amazon Web Services for anything, they don't negotiate anything. It's take here, have a nice day. So what do you do when you have a disparate risk and there either can't be a risk transfer, or maybe a risk transfer has been accepted, but you're concerned because it's only as good as the balance sheet of the person accepting that risk. So cyber insurance is evolving just at lightning speed. Maybe 2 years ago, there were roughly 50 products in the marketplace. Now there's about 260, and they're all a little different. There's no standardization. So there is a risk of cyber insurance because the CEO will say, what are we doing about this cyber exposure? And maybe the risk manager, I'm being a little facetious here, will say, got it covered. I got a cyber policy. May not have any idea whether that cyber policy is worth anything. Let me give you a very specific example. There's some very good policies out there about external intruders, right? That little example we gave you earlier where there was a W-2 phishing scheme, that's not an outside hacker. That's not covered by that insurance. Somebody internal fell for a spoof, and that's the typical cyber insurance policy would not cover that. Now they're now writing endorsements to cover that, but it is an extraordinarily complex and evolving space, and I'm a big fan of the risk transfer, but it's something you really have to mind carefully. So you've looked at this slide already, but I wanted to have it up here. This would be a really important thing for you to do when you walk out here today, saying, okay, if we have an incident, who's going to be on the part of the team? Think about this. If there's one thing that I could leave you with today, there's no destination. It's a process, right? And you got to start the process someplace. And very, very few companies can start it with a big bang. So you can say, let's start here. Let's start someplace. Let's start with one of our plans or one of our divisions, something, and then you go from there. But if you can get these kind of people in the room thinking about, what would we do if we had an incident? How would we respond? What will happen there is that will drive the ownership of good information governance. It's going to take 2 years to get from assembling this group of people to getting your arms around what you have. We've talked about practicing the plan. Well, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but this is not a throwaway slide. It is critical. once you have that team, to actually put them through their paces. This is an important slide, even though it's a little busy, but go ahead, Holly.
All right. Well, the reason why this slide is a little busy hinges on the fact that there is no single federal law to date that addresses benefit plan security. There's no requirement for employee benefit plans to sit down and protect the security of benefit plan data, not across the board. What we have is a patchwork. There are certain protections that apply from certain statutes. Before we get into the statutes, and we're going to do a very brief whirlwind tour here, what do these all have in common? All of these statutes impose security requirements, and as plan sponsors and business associates and plan fiduciaries, we will need to be able to show process, how we looked at benefit plan security, what were the steps that were taken in order to demonstrate compliance in the event there is ever an issue where it's going to be claimed either by the government or in litigation that one of these laws was breached. So for example, under ERISA, generally speaking, there is no ERISA requirement to protect benefit plan security. However, ERISA allows plan sponsors the flexibility to make certain disclosures electronically. Built into those electronic disclosure regulations is a requirement that when that information is disclosed to participants, it needs to be protected. It has to be secure. Personal information needs to remain confidential. Well, what happens if that information is breached? What happens if it is not secure? Well, what it means is that if you are relying on that electronic disclosure rule to be able to distribute summary plan descriptions, notices electronically, you have essentially failed to effectively distribute those notices. Okay? This can entail statutory penalties. This can entail breach of fiduciary duty claims. This is an area, however, that is still very new and unsettled. There is not a lot of guidance, and in fact, there has been no subsequent interpretation of this requirement under ERISA.
So I think the point here is this. As a litigator, what we do is tell stories for a living. And if you have the unfortunate job of telling a story of why is it that you got hacked, you've got to be able to say, we did everything we could. Nobody expects perfection. But for the breach of fiduciary duty, you've got to be able to say, here are all the things we did, and you be able to document them, and then you have a shot. If you can't do that today, think about it. Think about how you can get there. And I know we're running on time here, so I'm just going to mention that if you have an incident, it's a challenge because almost every state has their own breach notification laws. Some of them are internally inconsistent. This is an important slide, and we can't spend the time it deserves. We can spend an hour on this, but this is a takeaway for you. Think about how these various functions apply in your organization and how they can be brought together to get to you to where a process for good information governance and get ready for that breach. We have cyber at the end because it's something that people really need to be thinking about. There's no checklist to do it, but I would mention to you that cyber insurance is something that you should spend some time thinking about. So we have a minute left. Any questions? Sorry for the rush, but there's a lot of stuff here. Happy to talk later.
So thank you very much. We are now going to take a very short 5-minute break and then come back and have a presentation on participant claims.